What's on your radar, Ryan?
Earlier this month, the Transgender Law Center posted results from what appears to be the most comprehensive set of polling and focus group research ever released to the public on the question of trans rights. For trans advocates, there are a few cautiously optimistic findings, but more broadly, it warns of a very rocky political road ahead. The research seems to have gotten virtually zero coverage in the press, so let's go over what they found and then move on to what recommendations they make based on their findings. The clearest finding, and the one that raised the most alarms for the memo's authors, is that trans activists are getting destroyed on the question of sports. For most of the survey questions, the memo includes the numbers, even when solid majorities of the country are lined up against trans activists on a particular question. When it comes to sports, the numbers are so bad they aren't included. Instead, the memo describes the results like this, quote, "Right now, our opposition wins the debate on trans youth in sports against any and all arguments we have tried for our side. There is a huge gap in awareness and concern, with most base and persuadable respondents unaware of proposals regarding transgender girls' participation in sports, while a strong majority of our opposition has heard some or a lot about it." So in polling language, what they're saying is that even after a person heard all of their arguments, all of the arguments that trans activists make about the question, the person still fell on the other side of it. It's not surprising that the poll found supporters were largely unfamiliar with the entire issue, while opponents knew a ton about it. That comes from our polarized media, in which mainstream news outlets largely ignore this issue, while right-wing outlets obsess over it. If you largely get your news from the New York Times and MSNBC, and I ask you if you've been following the story of the UPenn swimmer, I'll probably get a blank stare in return. If you watch Fox or you're into college swimming, you know the story. The short version is that Leah Thomas is now setting women's swimming records after having previously competed for the UPenn men's swimming team. Her success has parents complaining about the NCAA rules, and the story has been covered heavily by conservative media, while mostly ignored by the mainstream media. The polling memo hints at why that might be. The authors say that they lose significant support even among their base when the opposition argues that this is fundamentally unfair. They write, quote, "When pressed, our audiences hold contradictory views, with a third supporting both a policy to ensure transgender student athletes can play on the team that matches their gender identity and a policy to require that student athletes play on the team matching their, quote, biological sex. Our base and persuadables want to support transgender student athletes, but are extremely susceptible to our opposition's argument that excluding trans youth is necessary to protect the fairness of women's sports," unquote. The good news for trans activists is that the memo found some language and framing that can move the needle on other issues, even though it doesn't work when it comes to sports. The memo recommends what it calls a race-class-gender narrative. Now, that's clearly derived from the race-class narrative, and one of the key developers of that concept, Anat Shenker-Osorio, helped put this memo together. The polling firm, Lake Research Partners, that helped put together the race-class narrative also put this one together. The race-class narrative is an update on a theme that 19th century populists pushed, most famously by Tom Watson, who said to white and black farmers famously, quote, "You are kept apart that you may be separately fleeced of your earnings. You are made to hate each other because upon that hatred is rested the keystone of the arch of financial despotism which enslaves you both." The contemporary version doesn't include cool phrases like the keystone of the arch of financial despotism, but the theme is the same. And one reason it's so persuasive is that it's completely true. Indeed, like the root of the very idea of race is tied up in the need of elites to oppress one race and pit poor people of another race against them so that they can't unite and challenge those elites. The trans rights memo suggests a similar tack. Specifically, the memo argues, quote, "We can and should connect justice for transgender people to issues of racial and economic justice, and by doing so, we move our base and persuadable audience on key metrics of support," unquote. The problem, the research found, is that many people think of trans issues as, quote, "a white person problem," quote, "The implicit and occasionally explicit line people drew between their own communities and transgender people frequently had a racial dimension, with comments indicating many participants largely associated being transgender with being white or associated acceptance of transgender people with whiteness," unquote. The strategy of linking trans rights to racial justice echoes a strategy advocated in a widely distributed 2019 memo that analyzed the rapid success of the trans rights movement in several European countries. One of the key lessons learned was, quote, tie your campaign to more popular reform. Specifically, it cited the success of linking trans rights to marriage equality and moving it all forward at once. It also then advised, quote, avoid excessive press coverage and exposure. It reads, another technique which has been used to great effect is the limitation of press coverage and exposure. In certain countries, like the UK, information on legal gender recognition reforms has been misinterpreted in the mainstream media and opposition has arisen as a result, unquote. The report warns that the news coverage can drive hate crimes against trans youth and that policy can be changed without it. Quote, against this background, many believe that public campaigning has been detrimental to progress, as much of the general public is not well informed about trans issues, and therefore misinterpretation can arise. In Ireland, activists have directly lobbied individual politicians and tried to keep press coverage to a minimum in order to avoid this issue. Similarly, in Norway, campaigners developed strong ties with youth politicians who then presented to the senior members of their parties on the changes that were needed. This technique was effective at persuading more senior politicians as the changes were being suggested from within their own party rather than an external organization. We also saw this technique in Denmark, unquote. The new memo points rather clearly to the problem with that strategy that is now being confronted. It's easier to avoid press coverage of a public policy debate, but once the policy is in place and things are happening in the real world, the press will eventually cover it. Directly and quietly lobbying politicians might win their support for a new law or a new policy, but if it doesn't have public support or public understanding, eventually its opponents will overwhelm and repeal it. Trans activists also have to be sure their strategy of linking the cause to racial justice doesn't backfire, as the memo suggests it does in some instances. So one of the arguments that lessened opposition began by noting that, quote, women's sports have never existed on an equal playing field. And it goes on to cite pay disparities before getting into trans women's participation in sports. Another version of that argument, which tried to link the unfairness to the way black women athletes are treated unfairly, worked among supporters to increase their level of support, but, quote, considerably increased the margin by which we lost persuadables and all racial groups, including black adults, unquote. The good news came in that some of the messaging was indeed able to move the numbers, but even then, the movement is underwater on key issues. Respondents were asked to agree or disagree with two different statements. One, there are two genders, men and women, determined by biological sex at birth, or the alternative, quote, gender is determined by who we know ourselves to be. Those considered persuadable chose the first by 24 points, even after all of the messaging. But by pluralizing the second and saying genders are determined, rather than gender is determined, they were able to make more movement in their direction. But even after that, 55% of their persuadable audience was still against the idea that genders are determined by who we know ourselves to be. The trans rights movement has made enormous gains, but not hashing this all out in public isn't going to work forever, and this memo is the first tentative step in the direction of recognizing that. And so this was produced by, a team of, extraordinarily well-respected and successful kind of progressive organizers and researchers, taking a deep look inside the hood of the movement to say what's working and what's not working. And this is their advice going forward. Another thing that they mention is that currently a lot of trans activists lead with the argument about discrimination and harm that comes from that their opponents are inflicting on them. The memo says don't lead with that. That doesn't work. That it actually backfires. That you have to lead, if you lead with a positive vision of everyone, including trans people, should be able to live a free life, that is the way that you can move the numbers in your direction. I'm not we'll see how well it's received.
Well, the activists are going to accuse these people of violence against like that. I mean, this is what happens whenever you tangle with activists on the subject online or elsewhere. You get, no matter how, they will accuse the most otherwise progressive people who agree with them on 95% of the way who want.
This is the Transgender Law Center.
Yeah, well,
this is. I mean, we'll see. We'll see if
they've run trans people out of their movement for not. I see them go after Natalie Wynn, who ContraPoints, who's a very good YouTuber on progressive issues, on trans issues, and every now and then she says something that sends them into some kind of crazy unhinged rant. Look, I mean, the swimmer case, it's hard. It's hard for anyone it's like hard to be on the other side. She's swimming laps around other players in this field. It does seem unfair. I don't know what the solution is going to be, but it
right. And the memo doesn't have one.
It doesn't have one. I mean,
the memo said that their solution was to. They said the problem that they encounter with people is that people see sports as a zero-sum game. Some people win, some people lose. Yes, that is how people see sports. They tried.
That is what sports is.
So they tried to reframe it as it's a learning experience. It's team sports is about collectively working together in a community spirit. And they said it just didn't really. They could move the needle on some subgroups with that argument, but in general, it came nowhere near winning, and that's the best that they have. I mean, right now.
We have to there is a real component to biology, to biological sex. Now, I think trans people deserve all the dignity and should make whatever choices are good for them. I think a lot of our gender separated spaces don't need to be gender separated. The public restroom at the airport or the bar, who cares? The more separation between one person and any other person in the restroom, fine. Gender separation, who cares? When you're talking about high school locker rooms, there's a lot of bullying and unpleasantness that goes along in those spaces. Those spaces should probably be reformed irrespective of the trans question, but I can see that it's a little bit more of a delicate issue. And then with this, I mean, what do you want to, people who had the biological faculties of men or of young men before transitioning just have a extreme and overwhelming advantage because there is massive biological sex-based disparity in physical ability. It's true. It's just true. There are not differences between the races. There are differences between men and women. Gender is rooted in a biological reality to a greater degree than race or these other things.
And what this research memo from the Transgender Law Center says is that the view that you just expressed here is widely the majority view, and they have work to do in grappling with that.
But that doesn't mean we can absolutely treat trans people with dignity and respect and equality in a wide variety of situations where they have been stigmatized and they have not been granted equality. Absolutely, but there are a couple tough cases where, I'm sorry, there are certain realities that we can't work past, in my view.
And looking forward to what's on your radar up next.